This time we'll be learning about active and passive structures. It's always a good idea to show your examiners that you have mastered a wide variety of sentence structure types. Passive sentences are among those sentence structures that are a good idea to incorporate into your writing when appropriate. By the end of this lesson, you'll be a pro at converting active voice into passive voice, and you'll understand when to do it. I hope you're looking forward to broadening your sentence building skills. After all, building sentences in different ways will increase your communication accuracy and efficiency. You will be able to convert a sentence from active form into passive form. You will also be able to convert a sentence from passive form into active form. And you will understand when to use the active form or the passive form. But you know the drill. First, we're going to have a look at your lesson challenge from the last lesson. In lesson 3, I challenged you to write 3 complex sentences using some of the subordinating conjunctions you learned about in the last lesson. Now remember, complex sentences consist of an independent clause and a subordinate clause. And the clauses are connected by a subordinating conjunction. Here are some sentences I came up with. She received the package, that's our independent clause, after she placed the order. That's our subordinate clause. He's a great chef, that's our independent clause, even though he sometimes burns toast. That's our subordinate clause. She speaks to her dog, that's our independent clause. As if he's a human, that's our subordinate clause. Note all the subordinating conjunctions written in bold. Those are the conjunctions that connect the clauses. And we know that if there's a subordinating conjunction in a sentence, then it must be a complex sentence. Remember, your sentences will be different, and that's okay. You aren't too familiar with these concepts yet. Here's a good place to start. A nice basic sentence in simple present tense. Now, before we continue, just a quick disclaimer. If the idea of present simple tense is foreign to you, you might need to review Module 1, Lesson 6 again to brush up on your knowledge of the tenses, because in this lesson we will draw on that knowledge. Okay, now let me show you an example of an active to passive transformation. Have a look at this sentence. It's in present simple tense, and it's in the active form. You already know the active form. It's the most basic structure of a sentence. So the active version of the sentence is Jane walks the dog. The passive version is the dog is walked by Jane. Alright, so take a moment to note how some of the words have shuffled around a bit in the passive version. In the active version of the sentence, the word dogs was at the end. And in the passive form, it's at the beginning of the sentence. Plus, the active sentence started with Jane, and it seems like that's moved to the end of the sentence in the passive form. Here's that sentence for you. Jane walks the dog. We've got the subject, Jane. We've got the verb, walks. And we've got the object, the dog. Remember those words? Subject, verb, and object? Let's have a quick recap to see if we're all on the same page. What is a subject? Now, we covered the concept of a subject in the last lesson, so maybe you remember. A subject is the noun that performs the verb, the doer of the sentence. In the sentence, Jane walks the dog, Jane is the subject. Jane is the doer. She does the walking. She performs the verb. Next, let's look at verbs. What is a verb? Now, we covered verbs in great detail in Module 1, Lesson 4. A verb is a doing word. It's the action or process that's happening. In the sentence, Jane walks the dog, walks is the verb. Okay, lastly, let's look at objects. What is an object? The object of a sentence is the noun that is affected by the verb. It's the noun that receives something or has the action done to it. In the sentence, Jane walks the dog, the noun phrase, the dog, is the object of the sentence because it is affected by the verb. The dog has something done to it or for it, and it is directly affected by the verb. Now that we're on the same page about subjects, verbs, and objects, consider this sentence again. Jane walks the dog. Jane is the subject, walks is the verb, and the dog is the object. In order to change the sentence into passive voice, we must change the order of the sentence into object, verb, subject. So do you see how the subject and the object have switched places? Okay, so now we have the dog walks Jane. I think there's something wrong here. The word order is correct and perfectly suited for passive voice, so what could be the problem? Think about it. What's wrong with the sentence? The dog walks Jane. Well, its meaning is wrong. This sentence means that the dog is taking Jane for a walk, which might put a funny picture in your head, but it isn't accurate. So, what needs to change to make the sentence accurate and correct? Well, the verb needs to change, first of all. Plus, something must be added to the subject to show that it's the doer. So, let's go ahead and fix this incorrect passive sentence. We now know that the verb needs to change. Walks needs to be changed to is walked. Now the sentence is, the dog is walked Jane. Okay, that's a little bit better, but something is still missing. Like I mentioned before, we need to add something to the subject to show that even though it's at the end of the sentence, it's still the doer. It's still the subject. Do you know what word we need to add? We need to add the word by. The dog is walked by Jane. And there you have it. That's a passive sentence. One thing you need to know is that in passive voice, the subject is optional. You can choose to omit the subject. So you can simply say, the dog is walked, and that's a perfectly acceptable passive sentence. Now, this is the reason why most people use the passive voice, so that they don't have to mention the subject or the doer of the sentence. So, on that note, let's discuss why we use passive voice. We use passive voice for a wide range of reasons. To foreground the object, to take attention away from the subject, and when it's not necessary to mention the subject. Let's look at an example of the first reason to use passive voice, to foreground the object. Sarah was invited to the party. The object, Sarah, is foregrounded because the focus of the sentence isn't on the person who invited Sarah, but rather the focus is on Sarah herself, who is the object of the sentence, as she has been affected by the verb. Remember, saying the subject is optional in passive voice, and that's why it's in brackets. Alright, now let's look at taking attention away from the subject. My phone has been damaged. I've crossed out the subject by James because in this case the point is to completely omit the subject. It might be embarrassing for James, as I'm sure he would feel very guilty for damaging someone's phone. You'd want to use passive voice and omit the subject because you don't want to make it clear who damaged the phone. Next, let's look at an instance when it's not necessary to mention the subject. I'm being dropped off at the airport at 10 a.m. I've crossed out the subject by a taxi because it's simply not necessary to mention who is dropping you off. It just doesn't make a difference. The point is that you're being dropped off at a specific time, and any other information about transport and so on is irrelevant to the purpose of the sentence. Remember, when we communicate, we are trying to communicate efficiently, so you don't have to bring up irrelevant information. Okay, so now that you understand the basic structure of a passive sentence and also the reasons for using passive voice, you can learn about the different ways in which the verb changes when a sentence changes from active to passive voice. Yes, the verb changes depending on the tense of the sentence. So, we need to look at each tense separately to see how the verb changes when we convert sentences from active voice into passive voice. But first, let's talk about what's coming up in Lesson 5. You are going to learn how to describe things and actions. You'll learn how to use intensifiers and degrees of comparison to optimize your descriptive writing and speaking. This will ultimately help you with your speaking and writing skills, and give you the skills to give detailed descriptions of events and things so that you can get your messages across as effectively and accurately as possible. So, I look forward to seeing you there. Now let's have a look at the different tenses and how passive constructions differ. Let's start with past simple tense. Let's look at a sentence in past simple tense. Jane walked the dog. We've got our subject, Jane. We've got our verb in past simple tense, walked. And we've got our object, the dog. Let's have a look at how the past simple tense verb changes in passive form. So, we know that to convert a sentence into passive voice, the order of the sentence changes to object, verb, subject. So, here's the passive sentence. The dog was walked by Jane. As you can see, the verb changes from walked to was walked. Here's a quick question for you. Can you fill in the blank? Look at the sentence. The difference between this sentence and the previous sentence is that the object, the dogs, is in plural form. Is it the dogs was walked by Jane, or the dogs were walked by Jane? The correct answer is were. It's very, very important to note that an auxiliary verb like was and were, and has and have, always refer to the noun that comes before it. So, since the word dogs is in plural form, the auxiliary verb refers to a plural word, and thus it's were and not was. Okay, now it's time to practice your skills. Convert the following sentence into passive voice. John created an artwork. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. The correct passive form of the sentence is, an artwork was created by John. If you got it right, well done. If not, don't worry, you'll get there soon. Alright, so in the first core topic, we actually already looked at present simple tenses. So let's do a quick recap now. We have our subject, our verb, and our object in active form. Jane walks the dog. And then for our passive form, we need an object, we need a verb, and we need a subject. So the sentence is, the dog is walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from walks to is walked in the present simple tense. Great, now it's practice time. Convert the sentence into passive voice. Sally accepts the offers. I'll give you a few seconds. The correct answer is, the offers are accepted by Sally. Remember, the plural form of is are. So, since the word offers is in plural form, you have to say, the offers are accepted, and not the offers is accepted. Did you get it right? Well done if you did. Next, we're going to look at future simple tense passive constructions. In the active form, we've got our subject, Jane, we've got our verb in future simple tense, walk, and we've got our object, the dog. Let's have a look at how the past simple tense verb changes in passive form. So we know that to convert a sentence into passive voice, the order of this sentence changes to object, verb, subject. Here's the passive sentence. The dog will be walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from will walk to will be walked. Okay, it's practice time again. Convert the sentence into passive voice. James will help Sam. I'll give you a few seconds. The correct answer is, Sam will be helped by James. Okay, now it's time to look at the continuous tenses. You might notice that we don't cover future continuous tense in this lesson, and that's because it's extremely unlikely you'll use a future continuous sentence in passive voice, so don't worry about it. Okay, we'll start with past continuous tense. In the active form, we've got our subject, Jane, our verb in past continuous tense, was walking, and our object, the dog. Let's have a look at how the past continuous tense verb changes in passive form. Now we need an object, a verb, and a subject. Here's the passive sentence. The dog was being walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from was walking to was being walked. Okay, it is practice time again. Convert the sentence into passive voice. Catherine was admiring the mountain. The correct answer is the mountain was being admired by Catherine. Next, we have present continuous tense. In the active form, we've got our subject Jane, our verb in present continuous tense is walking, and our object, the dog. Okay, so let's have a look at how the present continuous tense verb changes in passive form. We need an object, a verb, and a subject. Here's the passive sentence. The dog is being walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from is walking to is being walked. It is practice time again. Convert the sentence into passive voice. Kate is eating dessert. The correct answer is dessert is being eaten by Kate. Did you know that the correct form of the verb is eaten? Eat is an irregular verb, so it follows different rules to regular verbs. If you didn't know, don't worry, the Module 1 Lesson 6 bonus lesson introduced you to irregular verbs, and the Module 1 Lesson 6 summary notes contain a list of all irregular verbs you need to know. Alright, now let's get into our perfect tenses. Let's start with past perfect tense. In the active form, we've got our subject Jane, our verb in past perfect tense had walked, and our object, the dog. Let's have a look at how the past perfect tense changes in passive form. We need an object, a verb, and a subject. Here's the passive sentence. The dog had been walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from had walked to had been walked. Okay, now try it yourself. Convert the sentence into passive voice. Ali had ended the relationship. The correct answer is the relationship had been ended by Ali. Okay, great. Now let's move on to present perfect tense. In the active form, we've got our subject Jane, our verb in present perfect tense has walked, and our object, the dog. Okay, so let's have a look at how the present perfect tense verb changes in passive form. Okay, what do we need? We need a object, a verb, and a subject. So, here's the passive sentence. The dog has been walked by Jane. So the verb changes from has walked to has been walked. Okay, now let's test your skills. Convert the sentence into passive voice. James has completed the assignment. The correct answer is the assignment has been completed by James. The last tense we'll be looking at today is the future perfect tense. In the active form, we've got our subject Jane, our verb in the future perfect tense will have walked, and we've got our object, the dog. Okay, so let's see how the future perfect tense verb changes in passive form. We need an object, a verb, and a subject. Here's the passive sentence. The dog will have been walked by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from will have walked to will have been walked. Now let's practice. Okay, this is a slightly longer sentence, but just try your best and let's see how close you can get to the correct answer. Convert the sentence into passive voice. By next week, Sarah will have invited John to the party. I'll give you a few seconds. The correct answer is, by next week, John will have been invited to the party by Sarah. Okay, just a quick reminder that irregular verbs behave differently. For those of you that attended the Module 1 Lesson 6 bonus lesson about irregular verbs, do you remember verb 1, verb 2 and verb 3? Well, in passive constructions, we always use verb 3. We can look at some examples of sentences in passive forms. Take note of the verbs in these sentences. The dress was bought by Jane. Bought comes from the verb 3 column. The layout will have been chosen by Sally. Chosen is verb 3 as well. The cake has been cut by Catherine. Cut is verb 3. The shirt is being torn by Jack. Torn is verb 3. So, very, very important. If there is an irregular verb in a passive construction, you can always use verb 3.